Let me again welcome everyone on behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I'm delighted to be the moderator for today's program on diplomacy and whether it can be used to avert a new Cold War with China. Diplomacy is something that is obviously very near and dear to the heart and minds and whole life of our two speakers, but that's also true for me as well, because I too was a Foreign Service officer, and so all three of us have had the honor and the responsibility of serving in the Foreign Service of the US government. While I took what I thought was going to be a 1 year's leave of absence from the Foreign Service to work at the National Committee on the visit of the Chinese ping pong team during 1971 and 72, 49 years later, I'm still at the National Committee. But our other two Foreign Service officers who are speakers on this call, they went in and stayed in and did tremendous service to our country, both of them for over 3 decades, or just one, I guess, Susan, almost 3 decades, and Bea, you a little bit over 3 decades. They have, both of them, not only been role models for anyone interested in diplomacy, because both of them are terrific diplomats, but they certainly were role models for females, because when I joined the Foreign Service, no one would have imagined that a female would become, as Susan did, the acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, or that Bea would become the first Consul General, female Consul General in Shanghai. So both of them attained positions in which they did amazingly well, and as I say, were wonderful role models for what's now becoming not so unusual for women to reach the heights that they did. They both served in other posts. They had some terrific posts. I'm not going to go into that. You have their bios because we have not only a large audience with lots of interesting and thoughtful people involved, but we've also had a lot of questions come in from the audience even before they started. So I don't want to take very much time, but we do want to run this as a conversation as opposed to each of them making a presentation. And I do want to note for the foreign services out there in the audience that if you want to chime in on this conversation, you should let us know. Anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment on something that that either Bea or Susan have raised, please just go to the bottom of your screen and click on the Q&A, and that question will go to me and to my colleagues who are helping me sort the incoming questions, and we will try to get to as many of you as possible. So I want to start out, that's the end of the housekeeping. We're now going to sort of get into the nitty-gritty and the conversation. And I want to start it out just by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about your own background, your personal history, why you decided you wanted to join the Foreign Service, and what, if anything, made you decide to focus on Asia and China in particular, or is that just the luck of the draw in some place you were assigned? So I'm going to, this isn't going to be a conversation where everybody feels all the speakers have to answer everything, but this one you do, both have to answer. So, Susan, why don't we start with you?
Great. Well, thanks, Jan. It's so great to be here with you, and thanks to everyone for tuning in on this beautiful August afternoon. And I'm really happy that we're able to have, you know, the three of us, former Foreign Service people, talking here about diplomacy. It's so important that people understand what it is that diplomats do and how important diplomacy is to the U.S. being able to achieve its goals in the world. So, when I was in China, I met a former Swedish diplomat, and maybe some of you know him. His name was Sven Burmester. And by that time, he had retired. He'd been a Swedish diplomat, UN official, and he gave me his card on the street in Chengdu, China. And it said, it was a black card, and it had a picture of the Earth from the moon, and it said, Sven Burmester, author and explorer. I thought that was the greatest name card I ever saw. But it kind of captures the spirit of what I think a lot of Foreign Service officers go into the Foreign Service for. They want to be explorers. They want to see things. They want to capture what they see. They want to really get into the nitty gritty of things and figure out what's going on out there in the world. And that was really sort of what is at the heart of it for me. I really like analysis. I'm kind of a contrarian, so I like to really amass evidence and see what's going on. I thought it was fascinating to explore foreign cultures, and I happened to be really good at languages. I spoke French and Russian before I came into the Foreign Service. And China for me was something that I had long been fascinated by. I was really interested in economic systems transformation, and I studied Soviet economics and watched how that transformation wasn't going so well, and really wanted to learn Chinese and study China and see what was going on in China, which seemed to be something really different. So to me, I think public service and responsibility combined with the opportunity to sort of be a generalist, change what you do every 3 years without having to go through the bouts of unemployment, and just, you know, being able to really dig into things and explore was what I really found fascinating.
And B?
Well, it comes from lots of different directions, and one big spark was, of course, spending 2 years on a teaching fellowship in northern Thailand after I graduated from Oberlin College. It was an Oberlin program. But I have to say, it's really kind of a family affair. My brother was a Foreign Service officer. I married a Foreign Service officer. His brother eventually joined the Foreign Service. And I always thought we should, the four of us should be featured on the cover of State Magazine for familial relations.
I'm amazed that they didn't do a whole volume on it.
I don't know how they didn't find us. But even odder was that 2 months after we got married, my husband and I started 2 years of Chinese language training headed for Beijing. And my brother and his new bride started 2 years of Chinese language training headed for Beijing. So the four of us spent 4 years in the China bubble, which kind of freaked out the Americans, but the Chinese took in stride as a dajiating, big family, and it's been great. Our careers went on from there.
Okay, well, sort of the premise for this event, or the idea for it, came actually in the wake of the closing of the Houston consulate, and then the obvious or expected reaction of the Chinese in closing our consulate in Chengdu, where I should say Susan once served, and where Bee's brother, Don, was the consul general many eons ago. So we're going to talk a lot about diplomacy, and then we've had questions on that topic, but also on several other aspects of US-China relations that we'll go into. But let's start with sort of diplomacy 101. So Bee, can you talk a little bit about the mechanics of diplomacy? And for several people on this call, lots of people on this call know what an embassy does. Many people know what consulates do, but I think it would be helpful if you could give us a comparison between the two, and what, given the fact that we've just had 2 closings, what are the consequences, intended or otherwise, when a consulate is closed, and what they do that makes them important enough to close?
Well, of course, one of the interesting aspects of a diplomatic career is that every post is different. But there are some of the same functions at each one. So you come in with some familiarity, but you have to learn the ropes as well. And that's part of the excitement of what I think Susan was talking about as we go from place to place. So in my case, I served at the embassy in Beijing in the early 80s. It was 25 years later when I went to Shanghai. So in addition to, you know, embassy and consulate, there was also this 2.5 decades of amazing development in China. But the consulate in Shanghai, by the time I got there in 2008, it had reopened in 1980. I should say there was a consulate there before 1949, so there was a 30-year gap, and then I was there after 30 years after it had opened. Was one of the largest consulates in the world. We were the 4th largest visa issuing post in the world. We had a huge business community. We had a lot of US universities who already had programs or were starting programs. While I was there, NYU established its campus, and Duke as well. USC had a global MBA program with Jiao Tong University. So all of that was going on. And the AmSham was huge. Business was booming and extremely important. At the consulate, we had a lot of people probably who aren't with the Foreign Service kind of think that embassies and consulates are all State Department people, but we had a large Department of Commerce commercial service office in Shanghai. We had an agricultural trade office, and those guys would always remind me that though we had a trade deficit with China, we had a trade surplus with agricultural products. All those soybeans, made a difference to our economy. We also had FAA representative. The Chinese were building a jet, and what FAA does is put somebody there who checks the testing all the way through as they are building the jet, so that we don't wait until a foreign jet is built to say, oh, it's okay to fly in the United States. We also had Department of Homeland Security doing container security issues. And while I was there, we opened an FDA office as well. This was part of FDA's first offices overseas, and it was a result of food and drug contamination issues. I think maybe one of the first cases was contaminated pet food coming from China. So all of those were integral parts of the consulate and the work we did, in addition to visas, American Citizen Services. While I was there, we had the H1N1 breakout, and the Chinese were quarantining Americans coming off of airplanes. If anybody in the row ahead or behind on the airplane tested with a fever, and they were sending them off to quarantine hotels, so we were checking on that. So there's a whole range of things that consulates as well as embassies do, but we also had congressional delegations came. We had a visit from President Obama, and then not your typical kind of event, but we had the Shanghai Expo in 2010, an enormous World's Fair, and we had a US pavilion there that actually had over 7 million visitors during the 6 months.
So when a consulate is closed, whether we close it, someone else, the people in that district clearly are penalized. You have to go further to get your visa and all sorts of other things. What happens? So for instance, Susan, I think you had mentioned in a call the other day that the people in Chengdu are actually still in Chengdu. They weren't declared persona non, and why do you think we chose to close the consulate in Houston rather than labeling a few bad apples persona non grata? Why did we go to the extent we did? And what consequences will that have both for us and for the Chinese?
Yeah, I think that the existence of consulates, it's a really heavily symbolic as well as a utilitarian function that they perform. When I learned Chinese and was trying to get my first assignment in China, I remember going to the venerable senior China expert, Jim Keith, who was at that time the China desk director, and interviewing with him to get a job in China. And he said, oh, well, we've got, a great job in Beijing. I said, no, I really want to go to Chengdu because, I really want to learn Chinese and I really want to know what's going on in China. And he was like, great, if you want to go to Chengdu, you've got it. So it was not, I guess, as popular in the sense of a career move, maybe, for somebody to go to a consulate as opposed to being in the embassy where it's the center of sort of the bilateral relationship and everything's happening. But it's definitely the case that in consulates, people really know the local community, and they get to know the society and the culture a lot more in depth. And so I think not having a consulate is not only eliminating all those services, which people talk about as a consequence of the closures, but it's really an erosion of the fabric of the relationship itself. I mean, you don't have the people who know that part of the country. You don't have those relationships. You can't, you know, travel as much. You can't have a feel for what's going on there. And you can't get that kind of resident expertise in the US diplomatic corps if the consulate's not there. So never mind that all of our China issuing posts at this point, you know, probably not with COVID, but prior to now, were major visa issuing posts. And, you know, we're absolutely critical to the sort of lifeblood of globalization, which is the flows back and forth between the US and China. Now, of course, all of that is in the crosshairs in this administration. And so that's what you sort of see this pulling and hauling. And to answer the other part of your question, which is why close a consulate, you know, that's a really good question. And I don't think we've gotten a satisfactory answer yet, to be honest, because I mean, this was certainly very atypical, and it has to be seen in the context of this kind of very, you know, kind of, I would say, punitive series of measures that the Trump administration is sort of every day. I mean, we had another one this morning, you know, every day there's another punitive measure against China. It's this kind of drumbeat that they've decided apparently to unfurl as the political campaign in the US goes forward. So I really don't think that their explanation that the Houston consulate was well known as a nest of spies tracks with then the actions that were taken and et cetera. So I'm waiting to sort of see if anyone, you know, can unearth exactly what, you know, the evidence is for whatever it was that was stated as the reason for the closure, and to see if anything further happens that would give an indication of why the Houston consulate was chosen. But I think, you know, typically, I mean, we don't typically close consulates. Other countries might close consulates to express diplomatic unhappiness. It's not something the US typically does. And sometimes we close consulates for budgetary reasons in countries where we have a lot of them. And there's always, you know, part of the sort of process of US diplomacy is these budgetary waxing and waning of the State Department. And so we have to often sort of go through a cycle of looking at how many conflicts we have and should we close them, but that's clearly not what happened in this case. So I think, you know, the only other precedent is the closure of the Russian consulate in San Francisco, which was done after a very long kind of dramatic series of you know, point, counterpoint with the Russians, negotiations with the Russians, discussions on what facilities would be closed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there were a lot of also mutual PNGing of various people that were acting incompatible with their status. I mean, the normal thing to do if you think somebody's spying is to kick them out of the country, and we haven't really seen that yet. So I don't know why it would be so different in this case.
Okay, let's go from the mechanics of diplomacy to the more theoretical aspects of it. How would, either one of you can answer this, how would you describe the role of diplomacy as a foreign policy tool? Sort of, can you measure it, say, in comparison to hard and soft power initiatives, or is diplomacy, does it suffuse sort of everything that we do? I mean, we all have to be diplomatic in our day-to-day relations with our spouses, with our families, with our next door neighbors, but how is it different in the world of diplomacy, and where does it fit between hard and soft power?
Well, I would take the big tent approach to diplomacy, that it suffuses, I mean, it can cover a lot of things. We've sometimes made fun of the words we put in front of diplomacy, but hey, we can start with ping pong diplomacy, or we can go back farther and talk about gunboat diplomacy. But we've had, you know, dance diplomacy, we've had scientific diplomacy. You know, all the stuff with the CDC that we're reading about, that was diplomatic. It was also scientific. Sports, I heard the NBA commissioner on the radio this week, and and they asked him about the MBA in China. He mentioned the first visit, the the Baltimore Bullets visit to China, which actually we commemorated the 30th anniversary of with the Washington Wizards in 2010. But he said, they said, well, what do you think about having the NBA with this relationship with China? He said, well, I just think exchanges are so important. And I thought, yes, sports as well as the cultural, the students, all of that I would put under the diplomatic umbrella, but it's partly because I come out of the public diplomacy world, that I don't see it just, that diplomacy is just covering the official relations, which is the more traditional view of diplomacy.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with B. I mean, diplomacy is the way of managing politics among nations in a kind of anarchic international system. And it includes everything. I mean, and I think, you talked about gunboat diplomacy. There are, a lot of popularity recently for the sanctions tool, which people include in the diplomatic arsenal. But I think we diplomats think of sort of tools of persuasion, tools of discussion, tools of soft influence, information tools that sort of get at the ability to persuade, a counterpart across the table to come around to seeing things in your way of thinking about it, or at least to come closer between the two of you to some place in the middle that's productive for both sides. So I think, the thing that is missing right now, I think, in a lot of American diplomacy is the consciousness about taking into account the other side's interests. And that's where sort of the State Department and diplomats are essential, really, because they're the ones that have the understanding. You can't very well have a negotiation that's successful without really understanding what it is that the other side wants and trying to figure out where they're coming from and what are their constraints and what is their bottom line. And I think, we oftentimes in the US, and especially in the US unipolar era, we have given kind of short shrift to that, both expertise and also accounting of trying to figure out what the other side wants or needs in our discussions. But I think B is right, that there's a lot of things that can be done. Certainly, the sort of old style diplomacy was done among great statesmen in a very sort of, decorated but very small room, closed circle, and decisions were made among a handful of people. That isn't the way we have to do it now. We've got, everybody in all countries are involved kind of in the foreign policy making of their governments, and especially with the new tools that we have and the media sort of access that people have. So that's all part of diplomatic statecraft now.
You talked a little bit about soft power, and you've talked about diplomats trying to understand what the other side wants and how you can most effectively get what you want using what the other side wants. So I've been struggling with trying to figure out over the last couple months, as this administration has sort of systematically gone through some of the soft power tools that we have in place with China, such as the Peace Corps or the Fulbright program, a number of other things, students that, it's a huge magnet. The US higher education system is just one of our strongest of our soft power tools. And yet it doesn't seem as if we are thinking about the unintended consequences of pulling some of these things out of the arsenal that has been used with China. Can either of you speak to that, why you think this has happened, and what the consequences may be, both for us and for China?
Well, I don't think it's very well thought out, or maybe it's thought out, but what is the end goal? That's certainly not clear to me, and perhaps the goal is to punish China, which doesn't seem like a very strategic way to approach these things. I mean, certainly the Fulbright program, Peace Corps, all the Chinese students coming here, there was a great benefit to the United States. Yes, there was a benefit to China as well, which is terrific. The idea that students were spying on the US, I mean, as Susan mentioned with the consulates, there's other ways, if that is your concern, to handle those, not to shut down an entire program. I highly recommend Peter Hessler's, I think, March article about the Peace Corps closing. He had been a Peace Corps volunteer 27 or 25 years earlier, I guess. And he was asked, he's now teaching in Chengdu, and he was asked to speak to the new group of Peace Corps volunteers when the news came that the program was being shut down, and it was being, China was being graduated because China had developed. But as he describes, over the years, 1,300 American Peace Corps volunteers have taught in rural areas of China. I think he wrote that some 27 have joined the State Department, so the department has benefited as well. So to me, it's very short-sighted, and it hurts us. I don't know whether it hurts us more than China, but it certainly does hurt the United States.
Yeah, I think that the Peace Corps has really been hurt by an evolution in sort of U.S. policy circles, and certainly by U.S. in the thinking of U.S. politicians, that this is some kind of a favor that we do to foreign countries, that this is something that, you know, is not really in America's interest. And I think we've gone far away from the concept of enlightened American interests, you know, these kind of more long-term programs of sort of building relationships and influence over a period of time through these people-to-people ties. You know, commercial ties are one way to do it. Educational ties are another way to do it. But, you know, Chinese is a very difficult language, and for having these, you know, Americans over there teaching in classrooms with Chinese students and developing real fluency and understanding of the culture, it's not easy to do that. And so I think, you know, this is going to be a real loss for overall for our understanding of China, but also just for that, you know, kind of long-term influence that it would help build. And I agree with Bea. I don't see how this is in the U.S. interest. It's not an expensive program compared to a lot of things the U.S. government spends money on, but we've gone in a similar direction with, and this isn't particular to China, but just in general, on sort of our assistance programs and other programs. And a lot of things have been done to cut programs with China under the rubric of budget cutting. And I have to say that my sense is that that is, you know, oftentimes an excuse. I mean, the pullout of CDC experts from China CDC in 2017, that, you know, just was crippling to our ability to work with the Chinese on this current COVID-19 pandemic, was all done under the rubric of sort of, you know, budgetary cuts and et cetera. But, you know, it's all part of a piece, which is to say that, you know, we don't really think that we need to have this kind of collaboration with China anymore. And I agree with Bea, it's not really clear what the goal of that statement is. We don't need this collaboration because why? Because we're trying to punish China? Because truly we think they don't, you know, we don't need to have these connections? I mean, it's never really been made clear. And I think it's probably to our, as we're finding out now, actually, not even long-term detriment, but actually immediate detriment.
Well, another, you talk about that as a rubric that we've used, the budget cutting excuse, but also one of the rubrics that's been tossed out lately and seemed not tossed out, but seems to have been a real reason behind some of the moves we've made is that of reciprocity. So my question, maybe Susan, is reciprocity really a diplomatic tool, or is it something we resort to when diplomacy fails?
I think reciprocity can be a useful tool but in very narrow circumstances, and really only in cases where you have an exactly symmetrical kind of setup between two countries. So the place where I've seen reciprocity actually, you know, be helpful, and it's usually not on big strategic questions or on issues where countries have a major interest. I mean, they're not going to move on a major interest area because of a reciprocity kind of thing that say the U.S. does to itself to try to persuade China to change something. But, you know, in cases where, for example, treatment of foreign missions, you know, we give parking tickets to diplomats in New York City who park illegally. And so now other countries, because of reciprocity, also give parking tickets to our diplomats, which they should. That's just reasonable, but it's reciprocal. They used to not give parking tickets to US diplomats, now they do. Things like that are you know, ways of kind of equalizing treatment and taking like little festering nitpicky things off the table. You just both sides do the same thing and it's fair, and it's seen it to be fair by both sides. But it doesn't work for bigger issues or issues where the two systems are not compatible. And my contention is in the US-China relationship, you know, China can always win with reciprocity against the US. I don't think it's in our interest to use reciprocity with China, because we have values and principles that we're going to hold to no matter what the reciprocal treatment is. And if we go pursue reciprocity, it actually lowers the US down to the level of China. And it hurts us more than it hurts them. They're perfectly happy to go lower than us on some of these issues. So I really think it's been malused, and I wish we would stop talking about it, frankly. It's not a recipe for good diplomacy.
I agree 100%. Some of the things we've done, the reciprocity on the journalists, you know, it harms us not having access to more information in China, and it harms us by not having Chinese journalists here to talk about the United States in a way that might be more favorable than what the government might be saying. So in all sorts of ways. So
and most importantly, in many cases, it actually helps the Chinese government achieve one of their goals that was not in our interest. For example, the closure of the consulate in Chengdu. We were the earliest country to get a consulate in Chengdu. We applied, they didn't want to do it because they didn't want that close access to the Tibetan Plateau, but we insisted and we got it. All the other countries who came after us had to go to Chongqing to open their consulates. Now they've closed Chengdu, and it's not going to be easy to get it reopened. Same with the journalists. I don't think the Chinese really mind so much that, you know, some of their journalists have to change their visa status or leave or whatever. They don't mind that. So it's not actually hurting China at all.
Right. And they're probably happier not to have Fulbright scholars running around asking a lot of questions
Absolutely.
of people and interviewing them.
Absolutely.
I have more questions, and I'm going to skip now because we've gotten so many wonderful questions in both before we began this discussion and since then. And I'm going to lump sort of three of them together because they all are getting at the same question. And there may be others that I haven't seen yet that get to this question as well, because I think it's a popular one. The first one was asked by Jesse Appel, and those of you who don't know Jesse, I strongly urge you to go on YouTube and find him, because Jesse runs he's the founder of something called the US-China Comedy Center. And when you hear his question, you'll understand why he's asking this, which is, what are the most effective ways for regular citizens to influence diplomacy on US-China issues? And Jesse himself has certainly found, in his use of humor and in his sort of support of comedians, both Chinese and Americans, to interact with one another, he's found one way that ordinary citizens can do that. But let me give you the other two questions together, and even though B, one of them is aimed directly at you, maybe we'll have you start and then Susan come on. The second question is from Guangmeng Tong, who runs Ping Pong Arts, which is a wonderful organization that brings American cultural activities to China, or at least it has in the past. And she wants to know what the role of cultural diplomacy in reversing a near Cold War situation for the United States and China can be, and how can non-official, non-governmental level exchanges do something at this time to smooth the decoupling process and get the two countries back on better terms. And then there was a question, and Dee, this is the one directly to you. It's from David Utes, who runs Yale China program. He says, you've served as a diplomat and also as an officer for USIS Cultural Exchange and had an experience early on in educational exchange. So given the current impasse in government-to-government relations, can you speak to how people-to-people diplomacy in education, cultural, business, humanitarian, and nonprofit realms might keep US-China engagement alive and perhaps play a role in its restoration if we're lucky? So 3 questions, all basically with the same thought behind them.
Yeah. Well, on the, what can regular citizens do? Of course, the National Committee is in the catbird seat for that, for answering that question, because I can think of hosting professional fellows, hosting international visitors. There's lots of State Department sponsored and also other programs that bring Chinese visitors to the United States, and whether hosting them for dinner or hosting them for a couple of weeks or hosting students in your house. One of the issues we've seen with the huge number of Chinese students on campuses is that too often they they get on WeChat. That's their method of communication. They can be very isolated on campus. So certainly, if you're a part of a campus community and you can reach out to Chinese students, that would be very helpful too. That was for the part about regular citizens. I've lost the thread of all the other variations on the question, but certainly student exchanges, well, Peace Corps, but there are many other, there's, the Yale China program, Princeton in Asia, Oberlin. There are lots of programs that send teachers and bring people from those campuses to the United States as well. And sometimes those are the ones that put down the deepest roots.
Can I weigh in a little bit here on, well, I'd like to answer the question about what can American citizens do? We need some help here, and we have a democracy and our citizens have a voice, and that voice is expressed through your elected representative in the United States Congress. And if you think something is amiss with kinds of things that they are doing or pursuing in foreign policy, I would really beg you to please write a letter to your, congressman, senator, to Donald Trump, to whoever you'd like, and you can write many letters if you like. But expressing your view that is maybe different from what is being, expressed by your representative or in the mainstream media or on whatever media you watch. I mean, our representatives do get these letters and they do use them and answer them. And that is a way of kind of them hearing what people think out there. And I think actually right now on China policy, there is a Washington bubble and they're not hearing many different opinions and voices from outside. And you can really provide that. I mean, we have access to that as, that's our system of government. So I think people should feel empowered to do that and express whatever it is you want to say. I would definitely urge that. But let me just make a comment about Confucius Institutes, because that's been in the news recently too. And I have deep and passionate views on this issue, but I just like to mention for everyone out there, because this is really poorly understood, and Bea alluded to it earlier, but I just want to foot stomp this point. There are many American universities with programs, even whole campuses in China that are attended by, I don't know, Bea, if you know how many Chinese students attend these programs, but it is many, many thousands of Chinese students, in addition to the 350,000 that we hear about a lot that are studying in the US already. So Chinese universities actually don't have anything comparable to what we have in China here in the United States. Confucius Institutes are not comparable to these, you know, Duke Kunshan University or NYU's campus in Shanghai. So, you know, I think it's important for people to understand the imbalance in the amount of educational resources that we are able to bring to Chinese students and the amount of educational resources that the Chinese try to bring to American students in the form of Confucius Institutes. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk more about my views on this, but I just want to make sure that people understand that there is a real lot going on for the United States in China on educational programming, not just the American corners that the US embassies and consulates have, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what we've got going on over there.
Right, and in the end, the loss of the Confucius Institutes, because they gained so much traction because they were filling a need that we had in this country, because state legislators were pulling money from universities and from public school systems because of budgetary reasons to have Chinese classes being taught. And while yes, there were some Confucius Institutes that did try to probably overstep their bounds, what China was trying to do with that was to use a soft power tool that France uses, Germany uses it, we used it. You know, USIA that I worked for and that he worked for, we had, you know, we taught initially English language classes, and we brought people into libraries, and we were trying, and the Goethe Institute and the Alliance Française, all of them are there to teach language, which is what the majority of Confucius Institutes have done. Again, some of them have gotten bad raps because they've overstepped their bounds, but we are the ones who are losing. And I doubt that many state legislatures are going to fill the gaps and give money to start teaching Chinese language again when many of the Confucius Institutes that have closed depart. And so it's to the detriment if we need to be training future sinologists to play the kinds of roles that you two have played. They've got to start learning language someplace. And unfortunately, a lot of states are going to be lacking that.
Well, one of the problems with the Confucius Institutes, though, is the lack of transparency. I guess Hanban required these to be secretive contracts. And so our universities also need, I mean, as you said, state legislatures need to fund language programs so universities don't have to rely on money from the Chinese government to educate students in Chinese, but the universities themselves also should be taking a stronger oversight of that.
Yeah. And certainly a lot of mistakes were made when Confucius Institutes first came in, both by the Chinese, I think, in deciding to not put up standalone institutions like Alliance Française or Goethe Institute or USIA used to do. But also with that whole transparency issue. Now that has changed. Almost every Confucius Institute contract that I know of now that still exists, they are totally open. But unfortunately that brush has tarred all of them, even the ones who now are being transparent and who only teach language. There are more questions along this line, but let me get to the Cold War issue, which is something that was in our title. And two questions on this, one from Natasha Locke, who's with Yenjing Academy, who asks, is the Cold War template at the least too simple and at the most a dangerous paradigm to apply to the contemporary US-China relationship? And then another one that I want to ask, it was specifically asked of you, Susan, a question from Ms. Thornton. With your experience with the US State Department in Eurasia and East Asia, what would be the differences between potential Cold War with China and the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union?
Yeah, well, the title of our program is How Can Diplomacy Avert a New Cold War? And I mean, I've been a participant in a lot of discussions about the issue of whether or not a new Cold War is the right framing. And I actually think it isn't the right framing, but I think we're going to be stuck with this moniker because Henry Kissinger has used it, and you know, a lot of high-level US government officials have used it, and Chinese counterparts keep using it. So I think we will be stuck with it for a while. So it is good to get into the aspects of how it's different from the last Cold War. And also, I mean, I hope we have a chance to talk about what can and should be done to avert a new Cold War, because clearly I don't think it's in either country's interests, and I don't think it's really the place where we ought to be expending all of our resources at the moment, as far as you know, the future development of both China and the United States and the international system. So, but certainly the Cold War, in my view, you know, was a very stark feature of it was the ideological expansionism of the Soviet Union that was declared. It was an ideological competition, and there was an element of Soviet expansionism that was also part of that, and a whole series of theoretical kind of developments that were laid out and seen to be the inexorable future. And this was a systems competition. Now, many people say that the current US-China competition is also a systems competition, but I personally think it's mostly an economic competition. And I think the reason why the tensions have flared so starkly under the Trump administration is because President Trump focused, when he came in, on this economic competition, almost solely on the economic competition. And so you see most of the action under the Trump administration to try to figure out how to sort of wage this economic competition in a way that's going to be to the advantage of the US. Now, I think personally that a lot of mistakes are being made, but I don't see this as a military competition. Certainly the Chinese are modernizing their military. There are areas where we have to be concerned about what they're doing, but they don't seem to be, you know, in the mold of starting or engaging in an arms race with the United States. I think that's something that they have studied and learned from the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. They certainly want to have a great power military, and they want to, you know, approach parity with the US, but I don't really see them engaging in a military competition in the way the Soviets did. And I don't see this really as an ideological competition. I mean, the Chinese have adopted basically a capitalist market economic system since 1979 in one form and another, and they're working on it. But they definitely have sort of abandoned the pretense of the whole sort of communist basis of their economy. So I think you know, the parallels are definitely over exaggerated, and the thing we have to focus on is the economic competition and how to wage that competition in a way that's going to preserve peace and prosperity for the world going forward and have it be fair.
Yeah, I agree. At the ideological terms that we're seeing in the belligerent posture is troubling to me. And I do not think it's a Cold War type situation, but we're drawing from some of those experiences. We're seeing people drawing from those experiences in some of these ideological attacks.
A question here, you talked, Susan, about the economic issues being front and center. So there's a question from an anonymous participant who says the most knowledgeable group of folks on the ground in China is the business community. Any thoughts about how to bring in China-specific experts into US diplomacy? We used to have famous Soviet experts running policy in the Cold War. I see no such expertise on China today, and the business community is ignored. So let me, while you're thinking about the answer to that, I want to ask another question, which is different, but similar in the sense that it also talks about bringing in non-diplomats or non-traditional people to be to help in the diplomatic process. This is a question from someone by the name of Ben Deese, and Mr. Deese asks, how can the Foreign Service recruitment process be made more equitable? I know many young China scholars and professionals who are interested in joining the Foreign Service, However, a diplomatic career can seem outside the realm of possibility for some less privileged Americans because of the financial commitments in scheduling a foreign service officer test, needing to take time off work to sit for the exam, or I would add to even study for the exam, or traveling to an oral assessment when state does not cover travel and lodging. So from two different perspectives, how can we bring different parts of our society into the diplomatic arena?
Well, let me tackle the testing and application process for the Foreign Service, because a lot of people are focused on that. Actually, applications to the Foreign Service are way down. According to the American Foreign Service Association, at least the last numbers I heard, there are about a third of the people applying to take the Foreign Service exam now as we had previously. So if you are thinking about the Foreign Service, now is a good time to apply. And please, you know, I always encourage everyone I talk to take the exam. I'm not sure, I mean, the exam used to be given on a Saturday, so I'm not sure about and it's given, I think it's only given once a year now, and it may be fewer locations, but it shouldn't be that inconvenient to take the written test. And I encourage people to take the written test, you know, multiple times. And I think it's a good character building exercise, but you can take it as many times as you want, and you don't have there's no pre-qualification. I mean, I had a person in my entry-level class, I'm sure B, maybe you did too, who hadn't graduated from college, passed the test. He was brilliant, Hispanic American guy, and, you know, went on to do great things in the Foreign Service. So they try to make it accessible. They are tried very hard to make the Foreign Service more representative of the actual population of the United States. I think it takes way too long for people to get in. So that is a huge problem. And it is a function of budgetary vagaries and hiring freeze vagaries. And this has plagued the Foreign Service for the last at least 30 years that I was in, and I imagine it was any different before that. So, I mean, you have to want to get in, but you also have to have a job, because it might not, you know, pan out for you. So you have to keep pursuing other things. But I just would be so encouraging of anybody that wants to do it. They should make the oral assessment easier for people to take. And I think there are people working on all these issues, trying to get more people to apply. I'm sorry, what was the other question, Jan?
It was how to get the business community, and use the expertise of the business community as sort of diplomats themselves, or at least bringing to bear their knowledge in the decision-making process.
Yeah, well, we've got a very prominent diplomat, a friend of both Bee's and mine, who's now the head of the U.S.-China Business Council. That's Craig Allen, who was formerly a Foreign Commercial Service officer, spent a lot of time in China. He works very hard to represent the views of the business community to this administration, and works very hard on sort of trying to smooth things out for U.S. businesses in China. I mean, I think business people are very involved behind the scenes in U.S.-China relations even today. I know a lot of them talk to the administration about the phase 1 trade deal, phase 2 trade deal, but I don't think they're doing it in a public way. And I think that is more a function of U.S. domestic politics than it is of U.S.-China relations at the moment. I think they feel uncomfortable and don't want to be in the spotlight at the moment for many reasons, but partly because of the U.S. domestic political environment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm sure that the business folks in Shanghai are talking with the consulate, just as they were when I was there. I met with the AmCham once a month to talk with them, but yes, probably keeping their heads down and doing it somewhat privately. On the joining the Foreign Service, I will say that, you know, there are many people talking about how the Foreign Service should be rebuilt, revamped. There's a Future of Diplomacy project that are talking about all of these issues. And there are clearly a lot of things that need to be improved. I think diversity and inclusion is a huge issue on that, but also the kinds of things that Susan talked about, the length of time it takes from when you first take the test to when you actually hear, and the bureaucratic processes. So I'm hoping that some good things will come out of that project.
One thing, let me just add, Jan, that we don't often take into account is that no matter how many times we change the State Department, reform the State Department, add bureaus, subtract bureaus, other countries have foreign ministries, and those are our counterparts. And they're not necessarily going to mirror all the changes we make to our State Department. And it makes it not necessarily more efficient to conduct relations if we keep sort of reinventing the State Department all the time, I'll just say. So oftentimes people don't think about that, but we have a job to do, and every other country has a foreign ministry too. And to some extent, let's not make it harder on ourselves.
So we just talked about how to get into the Foreign Service. I have a question, and I know it's one that I faced because I was serving in Hong Kong during the Vietnam War. And I struggled a lot with how to reconcile my own personal views with what my government was doing. And I just wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about what the morale is like in the current State Department, and how it is that people do reconcile what you think personally with views that you might not agree with, that you have to go out and advocate for.
So, I mean, maybe I'll just start. I'm sure Bea has a lot of good stories. The thing that has always been the most distressing to me in my career working on US foreign policy is the extent to which our own internal team was fighting itself. And so I think I always tried to be a team player. And I think anyone that goes into the Foreign Service has to understand that, their mission is to defend the policy of the United States of America, and different governments will come in and have different policies. They're trying to achieve different goals. You may not think that the thing that they're doing to achieve a given goal is the most effective way to achieve that goal, but it's all predictive, right? We don't know the future. So, and you have to be open to the possibility that you're wrong and they're right. So I think on most policies, there's enough, understanding of the policy, sound thinking behind the policy that you can understand how, okay, I might not have picked this way, but, I can support it and I can give it a try because, it's in the US government's long-term interest to have this goal achieved, and they're trying to achieve this goal by doing it this way. So, most Foreign Service officers can see shades of gray. In fact, that's pretty much all we see. We don't really see things black and white. And so it makes it a little bit maybe easier to be able to convince yourself that you can represent a certain policy. But there are some, of course, everyone has their line. And Vietnam War was a line for a lot of people. When I was in the State Department, the bombing of Yugoslavia or in Kosovo, the Kosovo issue, a lot of people quit from the Yugoslav desk over the war in Bosnia. And then Iraq, 2003, there were people who quit over that, and there have been people that have quit over other things. I always felt like if I was good with the policies that on the issues that I was working, that was, what I was doing and I was contributing, and I didn't ever work on the Middle East, thankfully. So I didn't come across up close and personal that one, although I have to say I, at the time, was very unhappy about the decision to go into Iraq in 2003, as I think many people in the department were. And Bill Burns, who worked on that policy, wrote about that in his book and his misgivings about having been, working on that issue, thinking it wasn't the right decision, but continuing to work on it anyway. And he apparently thought about what to do. So I think everyone has a line, and you just have to recognize that going in, but you also have to recognize that our foreign policy is based on our long-term interests, and that we do try to do the right thing. We don't always do the right thing, but we try.
Yeah, Susan's comment about we see the gray side reminds me of the old joke, I'm a diplomat, I feel strongly both ways. But in terms of presenting a policy, I mean, this is easier to explain on the press side, I think. You know, this is the government policy. I am telling you the government policy. You don't really want to know my personal opinion. So this is what I am presenting to you. I think part of the problem now is it's not always easy to know what the policy is. I think we've seen that in Hong Kong for a long time when you know, nobody could comment on Hong Kong because nobody was quite sure what our policy was. That, in fact, is a more difficult situation when you know, you don't have the speeches, the documents to put forward, and nobody quite knows what's going on.
A question from Tom C. I don't know Tom's last name, but I like his humor. He says, though far from perfect, the US-China relationship has helped benefit both nations. If the United States and China are not heading for an ugly divorce, one of us will at least be sleeping on the couch for the foreseeable future. The relationship between the United States and China has had a good run, embraced by 8 successive US presidential administrations. Is it likely we will have a wag the dog moment as the election grows near to divert attention from domestic issues in both the United States and China? So in other words, all of these, Susan, we talked before about closing down the Peace Corps, preventing more students from coming, all of these, what we see as short-term misadventures here could be part of a wag the dog situation, just trying to get China to overreact to one of them. Or the speeches, the quartet of speeches by very senior American leaders.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's come out recently that I think is really important for people to focus on is the extent to which foreign policy and US-China relations is driven by domestic politics in both countries. So there have been a whole series of things that the Chinese government has done about which the US is extremely concerned and unhappy. But the Chinese would tell you that most of those things that they've done have been for domestic, you know, policy and politics reasons. And I think, you know, a lot of things that are happening right now in the United States, given that this is a presidential election year, that this campaign is going to be very hard fought, and that it happens in the environment that it does. Clearly, a lot of things that happen now in the US government are seen to be a function of that political campaign and of our domestic politics. And so I think certainly the downturn in relations between the United States and China after the COVID-19 outbreak, which, you know, is clearly going to badly damage the US economy and all the other economies in the world. But this is the economy that, you know, Donald Trump was going to win re-election on, and he sees the Chinese as very much responsible for sabotaging that effort. And so I think, you know, the Chinese do understand that this is a perilous time. They see the litany of things that are being rolled out, and we talked about, you know, the various daily kinds of steps that are being thrown their way, and they clearly believe that this is designed in some way to provoke them. And I think, well, I've even had it indicated to me from senior level Chinese officials that they know that this is what the idea is, and that they will not fall into the trap of being provoked. So that made me feel a little bit better that we might get through November without some kind of eruption, because there is restraint on at least, well, at least the part of some Chinese officials. Well, whether they will rule the day or not, I don't know, but because there's a lot of debate ongoing inside China about US-China relations right now, and with their new 5-year plan for diplomacy being written at the moment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there is a lot of discussion and speculation about what is going on in US-China relations in China. But I think that they can wait until November to respond to a lot of the things that are happening. And at least I hope that they will wait and respond.
Yeah, I would say study history and hang on tight. I mean, this isn't the first election campaign when China has been a very confrontational issue. It might have reached new heights or new depths, but we've had the situation before, and the Chinese, I think, do understand that to some degree. We also have the Chinese expression about referring to Tom's comment about the preparing a bed, you know, same bed, different dreams, different beds as we go through this period. But we have had very difficult times before. So I try and be optimistic.
Well, we've had, as you can imagine, several questions on the election. Both Rick Neo and Don Krasenstein have asked in one form or another, how would a Biden presidency differ from a Trump presidency with respect to China? And they want to know in reality, not just election rhetoric.
I'll let you go first, Bea.
Well, I can't speak for either campaign, but I think the Democratic position is more similar to the multilateral approach, the international institutions, you know, not pulling out of the WHO in the middle of a pandemic, reinstating democracy. I don't know their position on the current VOA situation, but we know much more about what is being done by the current administration to, I think, damage relations. And so my hope would be that we could see many of those things reinstated, including reopening the consulate in Houston and the consulate in Chengdu. But I can't speak for what the campaign is planning on this.
That would be wonderful outcomes if we could do that, and if we could ramp them up quickly, which I'm concerned about. Susan, a question directed to you, actually from one of my colleagues at the committee, Jessica Bissett. Jessica helps run our congressional program. So she's asking, do you think the trend of Congress trying to influence US-China foreign policy via legislation will ebb after the election? It's hard to keep track of all of the bills and acts coming out each week, sponsored by both Democrats and Republicans. Under a different administration, would this phenomenon change? Or, I mean, we are talking about both, at this point, both the administration and many in Congress, be they Democrat or Republicans, all having a fairly negative attitude and all piling the bills up to seeing which is going to be more negative than the other. So what do you think might happen?
Yeah, I mean, the situation with the Congress on US-China relations has changed in recent years in a number of ways, and it's not a function really of this administration, I don't think. So I don't think it's going to change much under a continuation of this administration or under a new administration, a Biden administration. But it's worth reminding everybody that the prerogative of, you know, foreign policy lies with the executive. Of course, the prerogative of the purse lies with the Congress. And so Congress is continually trying to influence through the prerogative of the purse what foreign policy the executive branch can pursue. And I mean, we've gotten now like very, very close to the line, if not very much over the line in a lot of places. But I think Congress has gotten a lot more activist legislating on foreign policy issues in general across the board. And in the time I've been in the Foreign Service, I've seen a marked change. You don't have kind of the senior wise man senators that used to provide sort of a ballast for foreign policy continuity and sort of clear-eyed, realistic look at what's, it would be behind closed doors, but they would exert some kind of steadying power on our congressional impact on foreign policy. And we don't really see that as much. And certainly, you know, China bashing, I've said many times before, and it's especially true in this election year, is there's no downside for a US politician. It's all upside, whether it be on, you know, protectionist type trade issues, whether it be on sort of national security, whipping up kind of a fear of sort of national security threats coming from China, or other issues. There's just so many issues out there, and you know, they're all good for election prospects for people in their constituencies, and people can lean on whichever one seems to be relevant to their situation. And I think this is going to be very tough to handle going forward. On issues like Taiwan, I'm quite worried about the destabilizing effects of this very kind of activist and very kind of sort of pushing the envelope aspect of congressional legislation and congressional activity. There doesn't seem to be either as much, you know, I worked very hard in China on the US-China congressional dialogue. We had a lot of interaction among senators and congressmen in trips to China. We had, you know, yearly dialogue meetings. None of that's happening now. So there's very little interaction between congressional members in China.
Well, you just raised the specter of Taiwan, and it's always been on the radar screen of, I think, China specialists who feel that the most dangerous of all the flashpoints between the United States and China these days is Taiwan. I didn't want to end, I want to end with a different question. So maybe Susan, can you sort of take a quick, you know, try at talking about what you see in terms of Taiwan being a flashpoint, or even Hong Kong these days, given some of the more draconian legislature that's come out? There was a question that I didn't get to. Should Americans be afraid that they may be arrested, having said negative things or taught negative things about China in their classroom? Do we need to be worried about, like the Canadians have the two Michaels, will Americans have that happen to them? So it's both Hong Kong, it's Taiwan. What's going to happen with those potential flashpoints?
Yeah, well, this issue of mutual arrest is a kind of a reciprocal move that we really wouldn't like to see. And so I certainly hope not. I mean, I do think that China has a lot to explain about some of the aspects of the new Hong Kong national security law, and especially the aspect on extraterritoriality. I have a feeling they haven't really figured it out yet. The you know, details haven't really been sorted, and I have a feeling too that there won't be a lot of sort of looking for trouble outside of the borders of China on this issue, and but they're reserving unto themselves the prospect of extraterritoriality, in part because they've seen the US engage in that kind of activity, and they are doing it in a reciprocal way. So I think we need to keep a watch on that, but I am personally less worried about them arresting Americans for things like that than I am for, you know, other problems that are going to emerge with Hong Kong's continuing autonomous status, which is something I'm very worried about. I think everybody is. But with respect to Taiwan, just quickly, I mean, I think the onus on the United States and China and the authorities on Taiwan has been to prolong the status quo, which is a very actually positive outcome of the 40-year-long relationship of the United States and China since 1979. The fact that Taiwan is a de facto separate entity, democratic, prosperous, modern society, flourishing society is a real sort of achievement of our 40 years of diplomatic relations. And the idea should be, and the goal should be, and our responsibility is to prolong that status for as long as possible. And, you know, you can talk about what are the best ways to do that, but, you know, with each side trying to push the envelope, that's not a very good recipe for prolonging the status quo. So you know, you can comment about who's done what to whom and who's to blame for what, and that's not really very productive, because the ultimate loser in all of this is going to be Taiwan if it goes wrong. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
The last question comes from Tom Gold, an old friend of many of us. He asks, given the general antipathy toward expertise across the board, plus hostility toward China, how can those of us who've been in the game almost since the beginning, and I would add anybody who's in the game now and concerned about this, how can we convince the public, or those who matter, and the public matters, but the public and the policymakers, that engagement over the last 40 years has not been a failure? You know, since the Ratner, Kurt Campbell piece came out, engagement has become a dirty word. But those of us on this call, those of us who care deeply about the relationship, understand that it's been beneficial on all sides. But how can we get that out? Susan's told us to write our congressman and to use our voices. What would you prescribe for getting people to understand that engagement is not a dirty word?
Well, Tom, stay in the game. We need you, we need everybody. I also was just very much concerned to see Pompeo's use of the term blind engagement. The idea that the last 40 years of our engagement with China, that we went into it blind, we were pushing them, they were pushing us. This has been going on the whole time. We have never had a rosy-eyed view of China. What can people do? I just hope, I mean, there have been people writing about this. Maybe we need a Hollywood movie that portrays China in a good light instead of a bad light. But you know, get more students studying Chinese, get them to look at all of this history. I mean, I think it's been a pretty successful 40 years. I'm not surprised by, this is more than a bump in the road maybe. We've had plenty of bumps in the road for a thing, but we have seen this kind of thing before. Maybe not quite to this extent, but, and we've seen it handled before, so keep on trucking.
Yeah, I totally agree that the issue of engagement, you know, on the one hand, you know, we're portrayed as this kind of starry-eyed period where everything was all, you know, hunky-dory and flowers blooming. And actually, the 40 years were a lot of ups and downs and a lot of struggles and a lot of tangling and a lot of disagreements and pushing and hauling and shoving. But in that time, and Bob Zellick had a good article about this, where he listed all of the achievements of the 40 years of engagement, including the, you know, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you know, all the achievements that we've made with China and getting them to stop proliferation, stop, you know, fomenting revolutions around in various countries, and of course the economic engagement, etc. And there are a lot of other transnational issues on which we've made progress with China. So I think the idea that engagement was, you know, this kind of starry-eyed, oh, what can we do for you, love fest, and B, that it achieved nothing, are both completely wrong. And if more people would talk about that, that would be helpful.
So that is our charge from the three of us to all of you who are still out there. And there are a whole bunches of you who still sat through, even though we've gone over by about 5 minutes. We appreciate your time and attention. And we really appreciate Bea and Susan, you joining us this afternoon. And we hope that just because you're both no longer in the Foreign Service doesn't mean, I know that both of you are out there every day sort of forward the relationship, and we thank you for your thoughtfulness this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing more of you. Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this.
Bye-bye.
Susan, thank you, Jane. Bye-bye.